Pearl Harbor, Midway, pivotal moments in U.S. naval history. But a century ago, on September 8, 1923, on a moonless night dripping with fog, the greatest peacetime disaster in the Navy happened along the treacherous California Central Coast. In less than 10 minutes, 7 U.S. destroyers of the Pacific Battle Fleet and 23 souls were lost. This dangerous area of jagged rocks and underwater pinnacles just north of Point Conception has been historically notorious to mariners. To local fishermen, it's called Honda Point. Sailors call it the graveyard of the Pacific. But to early Spanish explorers, this teeth of rocks and pinnacles was La Quijada del Diablo, the devil's jaw. So what happened? What went so horribly wrong? Were clear warnings disregarded and new navigation technologies ignored? Did the Navy's chain of command play a crucial role? Human hubris? Or could this incident be blamed upon unpredictable natural phenomena? To better comprehend such a tragic blunder that led to one of the greatest disasters in maritime history, let's first set the stage. The 1920s were in full roar. World War I had ended only a few years before, the economy was high and the jazz was hot. Prohibition tried to dampen spirits, but Americans still found a way to Charleston. In the summer of 1923, President Warren G. Harding was a populist yet corrupt commander-in-chief. So, as a savvy PR stunt, he became the first U.S. president to visit Alaska on his Voyage of Understanding tour. And for his return to Puget Sound, Harding's camp had arranged to give him a bombastic military parade and presidential review of the entire Pacific Battle Fleet. After the end of World War I, the entire Navy was suffering from belt-tightening economizations, the most oppressive of these being limited funds for fuel. And therefore, speed limits were set at a weak 15 knots, crippling the true potential of our four-stacker destroyers with nimble top speeds of up to 35 knots. But for Harding's presidential review of 1923, additional naval appropriations were somehow released, lifting the meager fuel rations that had been starving men and machine.
We've come off of World War I. We're in a lull in training because there's no money for people to get underway and train. The Admiral, I'm sure, was looking at this as, I got to get everybody away because the White House is ordering this pass and review. I'm going to take advantage of this fuel and get everybody some training.
Rear Admiral Sumner Cattell knew his ships were lacking in battle preparedness. So Cattell capitalized upon the passage to Puget Sound to conduct tactical maneuvering practice and short-range battle drills.
They were doing internal ship drills. They were practicing damage control. What if we have a fire here? What if we have some damage? How do we fix that?
As part of the Pacific Fleet summoned north from San Diego to Puget Sound were destroyer squadrons 11 and 12, under the command of Commodores Captain Edward Watson and Captain James Toome. This fleet's Clemson-class destroyers, commonly called flush decks, were each 314 feet long and carried 120 strong sailors as full crew. Known for their maneuverability, tough armament, and an impressive top speed of 35 knots, these destroyers were at that time the elite class of ships in the Navy.
Destroyers at that time in the U.S. Navy were the elite class of the Navy.
The Clemson-class destroyer was designed during World War I, and it was basically a slight modification of the Wicks class, which was kind of the destroyer that was the most prevalent actually during the war. The big threat during World War I was German U-boats. And the way to counter U-boats is not with battleships, but with destroyers, small, fast, nimble ships that could escort convoys and have the weapons necessary to deal with submarines.
Officers refer to these lethal, lightly armored destroyers as the Greyhounds of the Sea. Sailors called them by a much more colorful nickname, tin cans. After President Harding's publicity stunt conducting the naval review at Puget Sound, he suddenly and mysteriously became ill aboard the USS Henderson. Rather than sail in rolling seas, the 29th President of the United States chose to disembark and ride the train to San Francisco, to the Palace Hotel. And shortly after arriving there, he dies. Gossip abounds surrounding the true cause, but the point is, the president who had just been with the fleet is dead. Is this chance or an omen? But it was time for the Pacific Battle Fleet to return to their home ports, and for Destroyer Squadrons 11 and 12, this meant all the way down to San Diego, California. And along the way, a brief anchorage in San Francisco for Fleet Week, which for waterbound sailors who had been training hard at maneuvers, this meant a rowdy time ashore in a roaring town in time.
It was a happy, fun time for sailors that had been cooped up for weeks at a time. And of course, San Francisco bars and cafes were very eager to take their money. There was a lot of merrymaking going on.
Meeting with all of his captains in San Francisco, Squadron Commander Rear Admiral Cattell was worrying over several propulsion issues that some destroyers had encountered on their voyage to and from Seattle. To address these engineering challenges, he ordered Squadrons 11 and 12 to make a hard-charging endurance run to San Diego.
Depart San Francisco 0700 hours, September 8, 1923. Rendezvous off San Francisco Lightship and proceed to San Diego on cruising turbines at standard speed of 20 knots.
As Dizron 11 propelled out of San Francisco in the morning, the flotilla had already been reduced in size as 2 destroyers had already set sail at midnight due to engine problems, and a third, the USS Reno, had also already limped out of port for additional testing as well. Admiral Cattell's order for a hard, high-rev run of 20 knots all the way to San Diego would prove to open the door to the disastrous chain of decisions all adding up to the Devil's Jaw disaster, because it wasn't only his directive alone, but largely how that order was interpreted so differently by the 2 squadron commodores, Watson and Toome.
Destroyer Squadron 12 interpreted the 20 knots as permission to go at that speed, whereas Captain Watson and Destroyer Squadron 11 interpreted as that's what he was expected to do.
Captain Watson had additional pressure on his mind for racing down to 20 knots, because if his Squadron 11 could set a new speed record from San Francisco to San Diego, he could perhaps make up for a black eye he had just earned in Puget Sound. Because during the Pacific Battle Fleet gathering, his squadron's newest destroyer, the Zealand, had collided with the USS Henderson, the very ship carrying President Harding.
The squadron had been up at the Puget Sound. The Zealand had collided with the personnel transport, the Henderson, which happened to be carrying President Harding back from Alaska down to Seattle.
Fortunately, very little damage was incurred by the Henderson. However, the Zealand would need extensive repairs to be seaworthy again. And the President? Harding actually slept through the whole thing and was only informed about the incident at breakfast. But Admiral Cattell, you might say, was greatly displeased.
I think that leads on to what happened later, because obviously you're a brand new squadron leader. It is never good when one of your ships hits another ship. It is really bad when you're there for a presidential review and the President of the United States is on the ship you hit.
Captain Edward Watson, commander of Destroyer Squadron 11, was the son of a rear admiral. As a legacy naval officer, he earned the Navy Cross for his service in the Atlantic during World War I. Watson steadily moved up the ranks and took over command of Destroyer Squadron 11 in 1922. So leading up to that fateful summer of 1923, he was considered a likely candidate for promotion to the rank of Rear Admiral. So to rescue his reputation, that speed record was powerfully enticing.
That certainly was never taught at the Naval Academy, that one of the things you want to do with a ship and a whole group of ships is to set some speed record.
While ashore in San Francisco, Commodore Watson runs into an old friend from the Diplomatic Corps in Japan who has become Third Secretary of the U.S. Embassy, Eugene Duman.
They run into each other during Fleet Week, the night before they're leaving, and Duman says, I'm on my way to San Diego, and Watson says, well, we're headed there tomorrow morning. Why don't you come on board, and I'll take you down there.
Perhaps Captain Watson wanted a civilian to sort of witness what a great ship driver he was, to be a part of this speed record going from San Francisco to San Diego.
And Watson is spending a lot of time chatting with Duman because they're both into Japan.
One of the reasons we sent the Great White Fleet around the U.S. was to intimidate Japan, because they were worried about Japan gaining as a power. So Duman gets on board. And he's carrying, for some reason, $3,000 worth of silver coins.
With Commanders Toome and Watson both heading to San Diego, Toome planned Desron 12 for a deep water course around the Santa Barbara Channel Islands, while Watson decides to take the shorter, trickier route, threading the needle between the islands and Point Conception, the critical left turn.
The quickest, most efficient way to get from point to point is to hug the coastline instead of going into the deep sea areas of the Pacific Ocean. And so there's a small area of opportunity to only navigate that area between the California coastline and the Channel Islands. It's a little bit more treacherous.
The history of shipwrecks there is ongoing. It hasn't changed.
They knew this. These are guys who had sailed these waters hundreds and hundreds of times. So their boss should have said, I don't think it's a good idea for you to be taking that course. He should have said something right then and there.
As if the previous collision between the USS Henderson and the USS Zealand wasn't enough foreboding, another mysterious omen possibly foreshadowed the impending disaster. Sailors are a superstitious bunch, and upon leaving Seattle without President Harding, the Henderson experienced something perhaps paranormal.
It was a strange ship on the horizon. It was all lit up, and it was a sailing ship with lights aglow.
Through the thick fog, a four-masted vintage barkentine suddenly was upon the Henderson, its sailing masts scraping the deck of the Henderson as it ghosted past. The Henderson actually turned around to see if the mystery ship it made contact with was damaged, but it was completely gone. There was actually damage to the decks of the Henderson. The event was even recorded in the captain's log. Many believed they had taken a brush with the legendary ghost ship, the Flying Dutchman.
These occurrences have happened all over that area. There's quite a lot of information on them. I tend to believe it.
While Toome had Squadron 12 depart during the calm of midnight, Watson chose to have Squadron 11 leave at dawn on the morning of September 8th, which would then set them up to reach the singular, dangerous eastward turn around the elbow of California on a dark and moonless night.
The guy who's getting there early should be the guy who's taking the slalom course, because you're going to be able to see the rocks, see the islands, and know when it's safe to turn. I don't like this idea that you're going to get there at dark.
Captain Watson was a destroyer Commodore out of San Diego. That's pretty much the equivalent job that I had when I got out of the Navy, you know, a squadron Commodore where you got a group of ships that are under your command. And Captain Watson did something that I find very peculiar and I think very much contributed to the disaster was he told his ships that he wanted them to take on a wartime footing. And he wanted them to simulate that they were at war.
There's an old saying, red sky at night, sailors delight. Red sky in the morning, sailors take warning. And as Squadrons 11 and 12 left before dawn on September 8th, the sky was blood red. Exiting San Francisco, Squadron 11 was initially using cruising formation 5 as a pack, but as they turned up the speed, they slipped into column formation 18, with squadron flagship the Delphi leading the charge.
They were doing a training maneuver, so they were in a long line, one after the other, so they're 200 to 250 yards apart. You're going to get a little faster that way because you're going in the wakes of one another.
Well, Captain Watson's in the lead ship, and everybody's following him because he's their boss. If you're navigating in a formation steaming like that, you are focused like a laser on the orientation that you're prescribed to be with the ship in front of you. In effect, what they might have been doing is saying, your position is 1,000 yards astern of the ship in front of you, and when you're navigating, you're trying to maintain that exact orientation. What happens there is the navigation team gets so focused on the ship in front of them, they lose perspective on the safety of the ship. What that required the ships to do was to take an undue amount of operational risk. And to please the Commodore, their boss, all of the captains of the ships followed his direction.
That was their job. But when you're in a formation like that, formation captain has the first call.
In the column formation, all you're doing is following the lead of the front ship. Some of the sailors said that the West Coast fog was so thick that seagulls could stand on top of that fog.
Well, the fog laid in. and that obscured the lighthouses on shore.
On their way to the big turn into the Santa Barbara Channel, 5 lighthouses would be key to determining their true location: Pigeon Point, Point Sur, Point Piedras Blancas, Point Arguello, and finally the turnaround Point Conception. Based upon the timing and location of each lighthouse, navigational and speed estimates could be projected, confirmed, and even adjusted.
The destroyers were steaming with no moon, very heavy fog. The actions of the ships, the directions they needed to take, were totally dependent on the navigator, his charts, his dead reckoning.
Inconceivably, the very night before their departure, Captain Donald Hunter, the commanding officer of the flagship Delphi, serving directly under Commander Watson, replaced the ship's trusted navigator, Lieutenant Junior Grade Lawrence Blodgett, who was very experienced with this exact tricky route. Captain Hunter pulled rank on Blodgett with the words, "The captain has big plans," because he wanted to be the navigator of the record.
Ego is not your amigo.
Now, Captain Hunter was a decorated officer and very experienced navigator who had actually taught the very subject of dead reckoning at the Naval Academy. But his time in service was primarily sailing in the South Pacific, and the jagged coast of California is one of the most deceiving and treacherous waters in the world.
What you do in this dead reckoning navigation is you draw a straight line on a chart, and that line corresponds to the course that you're steering when you're traveling. You put a little mark on this line at intervals of distance, and the distance represents how far you're going to travel in a period of time. And so there's this thing called the 3-minute rule, which says that the distance I travel in 3 minutes is my speed in knots times 100. So if you're going 20 knots, that says you're going to go 2,000 yards or 1 nautical mile every 3 minutes.
Dead reckoning is the, how ships have been navigating since, 2000 BC. But it was very much an art where you're trying to figure out how far you are going in a particular time based on basically how many revolutions your props are making, and you convert that into, okay, this is a speed.
They were traveling at an incredible speed of 20 knots. When I was at sea on my submarine and we were on the surface and we were in dense fog, we'd probably be traveling at about 4 or 5 knots. And the rule of thumb was that you should not go any faster than the distance you can slow down. And that usually translated into about 4 or 5 knots. The fact that they were running at 20 knots is hard to even fathom. And what that says is that you have no margin for error, because you're going way faster than you should.
To complicate the seas even more, large following quarter swells are causing the ship's propellers to breach out of the water.
A quartering sea would be coming from in this case, the northwest, hitting the ship in a fairly awkward position and causing the ship to do a yawing type of motion.
The screws are coming out of the water and then they would cycle before going back in. So Watson and Hunter are estimating that they're moving south at 21 knots when they're actually probably only going 19. Combination of the seas and the wind. That's throwing off their calculation of where they think they are.
Adding more instabilities to the ocean was that only a week before, on September 1st, 1923, the Great Kanto earthquake of Japan created a 40-foot-high tsunami that destroyed Tokyo and Yokohama, killing over 140,000 people. And just like the Fukushima earthquake and tsunami of 2011, the entire Pacific Ocean was rocked. Therefore, the currents of the California coastline were shaking like a bathtub under destroyer squadrons 11 and 12.
Well, think of tsunamis, and you've seen in the last decade, there have been 2 or 3 major tsunamis in Indonesia and in Japan, and you see these waves roll ashore and go a mile or 2 inland, 50-foot walls of water. If you're a mile at sea, you don't even see a wave. It doesn't have that ripple effect on you. It's all underwater and it waves up ashore. So the tsunami isn't necessarily a big wave that's pushing them ashore, but it's had this undercurrent effect that is pushing.
It took 7 days for that drift to get to this area. The U.S. didn't have the technology it does today to know that there was an earthquake that affects those currents.
Unbeknownst to Hunter, the new navigator, the disruption to the currents and shoreline drift caused by the Kanto earthquake had slowed Squadron 11's speed while nudging them closer and closer to shore. Hunter believed the ships had already traveled farther south than they truly were, because the ships were averaging closer to 18 knots than the 20 knots according to the propeller speed. Plus, they were slowly slipping eastward closer to the coastline. But dead reckoning wasn't the only navigational tool at his disposal. He simply could have slowed just the rear ship to drop a depth reading to compare to well-documented navigational depth charts, which would have revealed them to be in much shallower waters than he thought.
But it never slowed down to take a sounding of the depth beneath the keel, the fathometer. Slow down, take a ping. And the reason you need to slow down is because if you're going too fast, the transducers aren't going to be able to get the signal when it bounces off the ocean floor because of the flow noise. They should have slowed to about 10 knots and taken a sounding. The chart would have shown them they're not where they think they are.
In those days, we had very good charts to determine what the depth of water was in certain places, but nobody did. I think the Commodore got so fixated on, if I get the best score, I'm going to make promotion. And that was his only concern. Nobody was going to tell the Commodore that he was being reckless. That just wasn't done in those days. And even to a certain extent today. I mean, that's not easy to step up and say, whoa, boss, you're going down the wrong course here.
So the Cuba's coming up from Panama. It's a passenger cargo ship, and they run aground at about 4 in the morning. So right before these ships are leaving San Francisco. And they all hear about that. So they all know that the Cuba has sunk on San Miguel Island.
The USS Reno, which had left San Francisco early and alone due to mechanical issues, changes course to rescue the survivors of the SS Cuba. The Reno messages the fleet of its rescue mission, which reaches Squadron Commander Rear Admiral Cattell aboard the USS Melville.
Lifeboat sighted. Shipwreck ahead.
Commander Roper, traveling with the fleet aboard the USS Kennedy, radios Commodore Watson, requesting for his division to break formation and help the Reno's rescue of the SS Cuba's civilian survivors.
Permission for Division 3-2 to break formation to accompany Reno in rescue of ship in distress.
And Watson said, absolutely not.
Commodore Watson refuses to jeopardize his chance at redemption with a successful speed record by losing an entire division of his squadron to a simple rescue, selfishly replies to the call.
Permission to break formation denied.
This heavy-handed reply, overheard in all ship-to-ship communications, was a slap in the face to Commander Roper, who was highly respected as a voice of reason and solid authority, especially in light of the fact that the Reno is one of their ships, and assisting a ship in distress is maritime law. And perhaps because of this patronizing spanking, Commander Roper later hesitates to warn the Delphi of a severe miscalculation.
The doctrine of that time is you don't question a ship's captain and you don't question the task force commander. The principles of decentralizing authority, empowering subordinates, that wasn't a doctrine that was employed by any military at that time.
Getting everybody on a ship to be of one mind and one purpose and one mission. And mission is what everything in the military is all about. And what makes you strong is you get everybody to buy into that mission. But at the same time, everybody buying in can be fool's gold too. And that's always the greatest fear of a commanding officer, is that everybody trusts you so much they think you won't make a mistake. And some of that may have gone on. Nobody sits back and looks and says, wait a minute, maybe this shouldn't be the mission. The very confidence that allows people to succeed in the Navy can be a detriment to them at the same time.
As the fog closed in, the lighthouse at Pigeon Point dimmed as that last visible landmark for the fleet. Squadron 11 was left totally blind in the mists. Without stars or moon to navigate, a ship depends on its gyro compass for direction. But another strike against the squadron, the gyro compass of the Delphi leading the pack had just broken down, which meant lead navigator Captain Hunter is now relying on a merely magnetic compass and his dead reckoning experience. But he has one more newfangled technology at his disposal: radio bearings from the Navy's new RDF station.
Just a few miles south of Honda Point, There was a lighthouse there, and they had just recently employed radio directions. The navigator could use that information based off direction finders to know exactly where they were. It was in its infancy at the time.
The way that radio frequency navigation works is that you've got a fixed point on the land, and it sends RF energy out. On the ship, you have a receiver that receives that RF energy, and it gives you a line of bearing back to that point of land. And that's all it is. It's a line of bearing. And you could be anywhere on that line of bearing, from 10 feet to 10 miles to 100 miles. You're just on that line of bearing. You don't know how far away they are.
Given the flurry of maritime traffic in the area and the fact that the RDF station could only manage one transmission at a time, Watson had instructed his officers to reserve RC communications strictly for his ship, the Delphi, except for the Reno, which would be allowed to request RC bearings in their rescue efforts of the SS Cuba.
Another contributing factor was when they left San Francisco, Commodore Watson instructed everybody, radio silence, follow in my wake, which is relatively standard, but I mean, again, in a fog bank, in rough waters.
Part of the problem with the organizational structure of the destroyer Squadron 11 is that the construct to navigate an entire squadron like that was dependent on one ship. It was the one flagship.
So with the heavy responsibility for navigating the entire fleet through the gap between Point Conception and the Channel Islands, Captain Hunter dismisses the RC information from the new technology and will not deviate from his dead reckoning.
So they all know that the Cuba has sunk on San Miguel Island. So one of the issues, is like a domino effect that led to this. They are afraid of coming too far down, turning too late into the channel and hitting San Miguel Island.
You're not able to visually see the coastline, and so you're solely dependent on that dead reckoning technique.
Because of the wall of fog and the moonless night, the Delphi is unable to detect lighthouse beams, and the high seas and winds create enough noise to smother any foghorn. The Delphi's usual trusted navigator Blodgett informs Captain Hunter that they are operating within the limits of the radio station, and Captain Hunter reaches out to Point Arguello, the nearest RDF station. They receive two bearings that contradict each other, and Hunter dismisses them both. The navigator upon the Kennedy, however, discovers a sizable deviation in the fleet's course and speed. While Hunter on the Delphi is charting 150 degrees at a speed of 20 knots, the Kennedy navigator's calculations reveal a truer course of 148 degrees slanting towards the shore at only 19.4 knots. But due to the earlier patronizing attitude of Commodore Watson to Commander Roper over assisting in the rescue efforts, Roper blows off his navigator's plea to alert the Delphi. Meanwhile, on the leading ship, the Delphi, trusted navigator Blodgett continues to plead that they change course with urgency, especially as the next three identical RC bearings place the fleet farther northwest of Point Arguello than Hunter's calculations. But Watson and Hunter's chain of command is squashing all nervous intuitions. At 7 p.m., the Delphi intercepts a radio bearing indicating that Admiral Cattell's ship, which also had left earlier with Squadron 12, has already passed the lighthouse. Hunter is aware that his ship, the Delphi, on the speed record run should be catching up to the Melville, so Hunter anticipates his next RC bearing will confirm his own calculations as passing south of Point Arguello. But his calculations are wrong, and they are already traveling over shallow waters of merely 50 fathoms. Blodgett again urges Hunter to slow down and take depth soundings, but clear orders have been given by Commodore Watson.
No interference with the speed record.
Watson spends a lot of time entertaining Dooman during that voyage. No evidence that they were drinking, but who knows?
But incredibly, building up to the one crucial turn on the entire journey, Watson isn't even on the bridge. Hunter brushes aside Blodgett's concern and doesn't disrupt Watson's social time in his berth with Dooman. Hunter and Watson have estimated that at this point they should be 8 miles offshore at a safe depth of more than 100 fathoms, which is possibly too deep for their phytometer to even detect the seafloor anyway. But instead of simply checking as per Blodgett's insistence, Hunter incredibly raises the speed of the Delphi to 21 knots.
So there's a lot of things they could have done, right? And even to keep up with the speed they wanted to set this record, they could have had like the last ship slow down take readings, drop a depth charge down, and then see how deep the water is, and then look at their chart. And so Watson had all those tools he could have done and chose not to.
The fact that they were steaming at 20 knots in formation in a dense fog says that they had little regard to overall safety.
They're also on a little exercise, so they're not communicating to one another the whole time as well.
There were probably some junior officers who were like, man, this just doesn't seem right.
It must have been hard to just follow in this white wake blindly, literally blindly. But I would say in some ways, and rightly so, that's the type of thing that we were taught at the Naval Academy, is in order to achieve the greater good, you need to have somebody in charge, and that person needs to have control.
People not on the flagship who weren't influenced by Captain Hunter's personality were more concerned about where they were and what they were doing. Nobody wanted to hear from anybody else. Even the other ships in the squadron who were uncomfortable with this high-speed run down the coast, nobody voiced that opinion.
Watson and Hunter at 8 o'clock at night, an hour before they turn, they call their admiral, their superior officer, and give them an exact location of where the squadron is. They really don't have any idea. They haven't seen land since 11:30.
At 8 p.m., Hunter confidently relays his estimated position to Admiral Cattell. But other ships of the squadron, the Young, the Kennedy, and the Stoddard, have each calculated positions different from that of Hunter on the Delphi. Bucking orders to keep off the radio, Lieutenant Commander Bratton of the Stoddard requests 2 more RC bearings to confirm his own navigator's estimated position. The Kennedy also intercepts those same transmissions, which confirm their own estimates, and its navigator actually predicts that on the current course, the squadron will run into dangerous shallow water shoals at around 9 p.m. So he once again urges Commander Roper to warn the Delphi, and once more, Commander Roper's bruised ego refuses to do so. And although many other ships had similar navigational estimates, they too chose to ignore those warnings. For example, the USS Lee and Young both intercepted Hunter's transmission to Admiral Cattell, but both failed to react to the brazen error of Hunter, choosing instead to accept the leadership of the Delphi.
I'm assuming that Captain Watson was a pretty feared leader. None of his commanding officers was willing to say this is unsafe.
The captain on board the lead destroyer was back in his cabin and was not on the bridge in a very extreme foggy condition, and had left that responsibility to the bridge crew and the officer on watch.
If it was normal and you had all your fixes and you knew exactly where you were, it'd be perfectly normal for him to be down there, not to be on the bridge. But in this particular situation, they've been talking all day about the fact that they really weren't sure that they were tracking. And some of the people believed they were going slower than they thought. Some thought they were going faster than they thought. There should have been a discussion on the bridge before they made the turn.
And they are running out of time. The Delphi hears the Stoddard's 2 new bearings that indicate the ships are still well northwest of Point Arguello. But Hunter continues to dismiss the new technology over his years of experience. He requests his own RC bearing, which again positions them northwest at 330 degrees true. He rejects him and requests another. At 8:35, he gets the opposite reciprocal bearing of 168 degrees, which he takes to confirm that he is indeed past Point Arguello.
Without even thinking about it being a reciprocal, they threw it out as wrong because it wasn't what they wanted to hear.
Based on this reciprocal bearing, Hunter deems it time for a hard turn eastward into the eye of the needle between the Channel Islands and Point Conception. At 9 p.m., Watson gives the order to change course to 095 degrees true. At this moment, the Delphi is only 1.5 miles from shore, and this moment becomes fatal. Like a car hitting the brakes on ice, the emergency stopping distance of these Clemson-class destroyers racing at 20 knots is approximately 600 yards, and on this night, they don't even have that far of visibility. The sudden turn of the Delphi also startled the other ships because the change of course came without preface, no countdown, and not even communicated over the radio. They just turned. And then at 9:06 p.m., the Delphi smashes into the teeth of the Devil's Jaw and hits California. The deck log from the USS Farragut reads,
At 9:01, guide changed course to 095 degrees without previous signal. At 9:05, changed course to follow. It hardly settled down when sirens sounded ahead and ships began to break formation. Ships ahead were on the rocks.
And like a freeway pileup, they all smash in right behind the Delphi. The SP Lee, Young, Woodbury, Nicholas, Farragut, Fuller, Summers, and Chauncey.
They can hear screaming and yelling ahead of them, and they just think it's a man overboard. They have no idea until they can see, all that's happened. And nobody really knew how many even ships had sunk until the next morning.
After the Delphi was the SP Lee right on its tail.
The SP Lee managed to reverse engines in full and slowed down to 8 knots just before running into the mainland.
I think it took a hard port turn to avoid hitting the Delphi right in front of them and ran aground to the left, another one to the right. The Young, actually, the third one, some believe that it was actually the first to hit rocks.
The USS Young was first to be ripped apart under the waterline by the underwater pinnacles along the Devil's Jaw.
If the lead ship had given the other ships notice that they were going to turn, that would have given the other commanding officers at least a minute or so to get up to the bridge, and usually the commanding officer's cabin is right next to the bridge.
My grandfather was William Lowndes Calhoun, and he was the head of the ship of the USS Young.
Captain Calhoun was about to retire for the evening and had just taken off his Naval Academy ring.
Wouldn't be unusual for the officers when they were going to bed to take their rings off, because the Naval Academy ring is kind of big. Now, he apparently felt some type of bump, which could very well have been some seamound underneath the ship before the big bump. And as soon as that bump hit, he was running towards the bridge. It was only roughly 4 minutes between turning and hitting the rocks. If they felt the bump before he ran up there, he was probably a minute away from hitting the bigger one that gashed the whole side of the ship.
The commanding officer, Calhoun, talks about how the ship went up in the air and slaps the water like the belly of a whale. And again, they call them tin cans, right? So the rocks ripped a hole from the bow to the stern in that ship, and she was on her side in a 90-degree angle in 90 seconds. And 20 of the 23 sailors that we sadly lost in this incident were aboard the Young. And I believe most of them were probably below deck in the fire and engine rooms and just got washed out to sea.
They're all tending to their particular duty, and the side of the ship opens up and water comes flooding into it. They try to get out, there's various hatches and things, and the water just trapped them. That's a sort of a difficult position to escape from. You're used to things being up and down. Now it's horizontal. So it flooded and it capsized, and that's where most of the sailors that died were in that engine room.
20 sailors on the Young lose their lives right then in only 90 seconds.
We only found 17 of those 23 bodies. And then the other 3, of course, were on the Delphi, on the flagship.
There's not anything he could have done at that point. The most important thing he did was to tell people not to jump overboards and to stay on board.
If your boat goes down, you never leave the boat. You stay on the boat. You try to get out of the water and stay as warm as you can. You don't want to get hypothermic. That's going to lead to all sorts of confused thinking and all sorts of problems that could kill you right there. So staying on the boat is the wisest thing to do. The impulse might be just to jump in the water, but remember, it's going to be so cold, you can't see, there's still fog, it's night, you could land on a rock, now you got 2 broken legs and a broken arm.
Had they tried to swim to shore, they could have gotten lost and drowned also. So the best thing to do was stay with the boat until they had a means of rescuing. My grandfather was the last one off the boat, and before he left, he tapped on the hull because there were people who had been trapped down there to make sure that there wasn't anyone that could still be rescued down there.
One of the real heroes in this is a Chief Petty Officer named Peterson.
As the California waves batter the hull of the Young, her remaining crew struggle to cling to the slippery port side. But Chief Bosun's mate, Arthur Peterson, dives back through the now underwater hulls of the destroyer to retrieve a fire axe.
He recognized the problem. The Young is on her side, and there's no handholds.
And so he took an axe, broke all the portholes, and then he runs rope through those portholes because these guys are scrambling onto the side of the ship and they need something to hold on to while the swell is still bouncing them around.
Well, not only that, but he took a line from the Young and swam out to the Chauncey, or one of the ones that were on the rocks. And then the idea was it now would be a line to travel, and they saved a lot of sailors that way.
Though there's 23 people perished from this tragedy, 745 were saved, and 70 of them were from the USS Young because of Chief Arthur Peterson.
At that very moment, the Chauncey slips just past the Young and gets stranded as well. Peterson is spotted swimming in the oil-soaked water by the chief of the Chauncey and is pulled up on board.
In the Young, it went down so fast the propellers were still turning. In fact, the Chauncey, the last of the 7 ships to wreck in this tragedy, was actually trying to get as close to the Young as it could to rescue those people, and the propellers of the Young ripped a hole in the Chauncey and sank her. So they had to get back in the engine rooms to turn the engines off, and this guy gets washed out, and he grabs some flotsam and passes out, and then he wakes up and he bumps into something, and it's a raft. 2 guys in the raft, and they pull him on board, but they only have 1 oar. And then they hear some guys yelling, so they paddle over there, and there's 3 guys in that raft, again 1 oar. So they tie up to each other. There is a lighthouse at Point Arguello, and they could hear voices by then. And so they tell them to get around the point, and there's a beach you can come up to. So they try to do that, and I think they tried, I don't know, half a dozen times to get in. At one point, the guys in the second raft untied and said, "You go in, and we'll try our own."
These guys got out into the current and just said, well, we'll follow whatever current.
The ones on the first raft made it in, but the other 3 were never found.
There wasn't anybody looking for them, so they disappeared.
Stranded upon the crippled Delphi, Captain Hunter fears the ship may disintegrate and gives the order to abandon ship. While many of the men originally can jump to the rocks to save themselves, everything changes when the Delphi rolls over in the surf. Sailors fall into the caustic oil-covered water between the ship and the rocks. 4 men are pulled back onto the Delphi by Blodgett and the remaining crew. One of them is fireman James Pearson.
One of the guys, he had glasses, and the glasses smashed when that happened. You're going 20 knots, it's a major impact. And they smashed, and that glass shattered in his eyes. He went a little crazy. And so they tried to get him off the boat several times. I think they actually got him onto a lifeboat and tried to get over to the rocks, but he was just uncontrollable. You can imagine the pain and the shock he was in. And so they ended up having to tie him on the top of the deck.
Pearson was bound to the searchlight tower of the Delphi, so he wouldn't be washed away by the waves.
And they could hear his screams partway through the night, but in the morning he was gone.
After strafing the Farragut with the Fuller, Lieutenant Commander Walter Seed made several attempts to secure a line from the Fuller to the Woodbury, and the rocket was stranded upon.
They're about 100 yards or so away from the Woodbury. So now they can see the sailors on the Woodbury. There's right on these rocks, and so they're all getting off the ship and onto those rocks. On the other ship, one of the sailors says, "Why don't I take a rope and swim over there, and we could use that to pull the rope and get onto that ship, and then from there onto the rocks." Walter Seed famously says, "That's too dangerous. It's roiling waters. I'm going to do it. If I make it, you follow me." And then he turns to his XO, hands him his hat, and says, "Here's my hat. If I don't make it, you'll be wearing 2 hats." But he does make it, and they get the rope over there, and that's how they get onto those rocks. And not a lot of rock out there, and they spent the night on that rock. Walter's distant cousin was here in Santa Barbara, Harris Seed. Harris told me that Walter was never the same after that tragedy.
I can't imagine all the responsibilities and, pressure that comes with being a commanding officer or an executive officer of a U.S. Navy warship, but ultimately, you join the Navy to carry on the legacy, the heritage, and you take the oath. You want to do your best to carry that on, be as professional as you can be.
These are multi-generational guys for the most part, that even some of the sailors, their dads were retired sailors.
While the next 8 ships and 2 divisions of Squadron 11 follow the leader of the Delphi blindly, the third group, led by Commander Roper aboard the Kennedy, breaks from the pending doom.
They put 2 and 2 together and they turned out a column and they saved their ships.
After corroborating his navigator's calculated position, instead of following the Delphi's assumed position, Roper breaks formation at the turn and steams 200 yards westward, opening up a space between the Kennedy and the ship it was tailing, the Chauncey.
So this is interesting. So he has those 2 young navigators. They're telling him that they're too close to land, too far north. But prior to that, he had requested permission to leave the squadron, take his division, and help with the rescue of the Cuba. And so instead of questioning Watson, saying, hey, here's what my readings say, he just doesn't talk to Watson, but doesn't make that full turn. When they say turn 90 degrees, they do about a 45-degree turn.
Going back to maritime law, each ship's captain is responsible for the safety of everybody on their ship.
So what would have happened if he said, you know what, I'm going to swallow my pride, even though I just got yelled at, I'm going to give them my take on this reading. But Watson probably had listened anyway, so.
With the tide beginning to turn to outgoing, the survivors face more building threats: hypothermia, slippery and jagged rocks, covered in barnacles and mussels, floating debris, and the very crude and caustic thick oil at use in the 1920s. Even swallowing a small amount could kill a man. So, each commander had to act fast to make decisions on how his men can survive the night, knowing that soon the ships will lose power and be lost in total darkness, rendering any potential rescue operation blinded.
Another thing to mention is that time of night, most of the crew was probably in bed or getting ready for bed, may not have had any shoes on or any safety equipment on. And when something happens that quickly, you just have to run out and try to get into shore as fast as you can.
It's got to be frightening. It's pitch black and it's cold and it's wet. Even on the rocks, you're going to get splashed the whole time.
Just the horror and the fear of being able to get out from down below when you have water coming in.
They just had to be scared out of their minds.
If you cut open a boat such that it bleeds into the boiler room, there's going to be an immense amount of steam. When that water hits those boilers, and steam is one of the most feared injuries you can get. Not only got oil and gasoline, you've got this steam and fire and hot coal coming at you. I'm sure that there were a lot of severe burns, and that would have just been a horrible death.
The chemical compound of the oil in those days was not as refined as it is today. It would have been a problem if you got into that for 2 reasons. One, it would have burned your skin, and it would have weighed them down. Even when you're swimming, you're going to swallow some water. Salt water is bad enough to swallow, but now your contaminated fuel oil that you're swallowing.
The very best in men arises in times of crisis, and the sailors certainly rose to the occasion. The men of the Chauncey helped those on the Young, the sailors of the Lee aided the Nichols, and those of the Woodbury helped those from the Fuller. Soon the gravity of the disaster became clear. 7 ships were a complete loss. The USS Delphi, Young, Lee, Woodbury, Nichols, Fuller, and Chauncey. The USS Farragut and Summers slowed down just enough before contact with the rocks and were able to reverse engines full and refloat themselves. Roper's division in the rear, comprising of the USS Kennedy, Stoddard, Thompson, Paul Hamilton, as well as the USS Percival of Division 31, were able to avoid the rocks completely.
The ships that were on the rocks right there, they're climbing onto the rocks for an hour and a half. It's the one humorous thing about this story. So for an hour and a half, they think they're stranded on San Miguel Island, which basically is uninhabited at that time.
The stranded sailors think they are on the island until they hear a strange sound approaching, a whistle from a train.
At around 10:30, less than 100 yards away, are train tracks. And the train comes by.
And there are no trains on San Miguel at that time, so they realized, oops, we made a big mistake.
Although obviously there's major errors that led to this tragedy, that once it did happen, there was nothing but stories of amazing bravery.
A track maintenance employee of the Southern Pacific Railroad, John Jervis, was working late at the section house when he smelled burning oil in the air and then saw flashes of light blinking through the fog down by Honda Point.
The railroad had a line shack just above this area.
Jervis, or Honda John as he came to be known later, went to investigate by making a treacherous way through the scrub brush down to the cliffs in the fog, where he finally heard voices below. Jervis ran back to the section house and called another employee of the railroad, who in turn called the sheriff of Lompoc, California, and the rescue rush was on. The community quickly gathered what they could and raced out to the site. The Southern Pacific Railroad was one of the first to help and used their section house as a base to help the stranded and wounded sailors.
And as our sailors are coming ashore, they're taking care of them, giving them hot coffee, dried clothes.
More mercantile store out of Lompoc, threw quilts, blankets, everything they could onto a train. That was special train, came I think at 2 or 3 in the morning, loaded down with stuff to keep those guys warm, because now you're wet and it's cold, it's dark, you've got to be freezing out there. So coffee and blankets was probably vital.
My family was involved the night of the Honda disaster. More Mercantile was a family business, and they had a general mercantile store. That fateful night when the word got around town that these 7 ships had crashed, they went out to their store, which was near the coast, and provided shelter and food and blankets, especially to these shiploads of men that had fallen in the water or were stranded.
Commodore Watson stepped up to help triage the injured and coordinate transport of the most wounded men to Cottage Hospital in Santa Barbara. The uninjured sailors were transported back to San Diego by train.
How many medical personnel actually made it? I don't know how many of those lost their lives or were so injured they couldn't help anybody. But clearly at that point, there would have been sort of 3 types of injuries. Somebody that was just very, very lucky that had a minor scratch or a bruise that you could just bandage, that didn't really need any further care until they got home. The other side of that spectrum would be somebody who was so severely damaged that they obviously were dying or were dead. And there's really nothing to do at that point for those poor unfortunate souls. But really then you have this group in the middle that really needs to be transported and dealt with. These would have been people with broken bones, cracked skulls, a bleeding spleen or a bleeding liver. So those people would have needed to have been temporized somehow, and then, as I understand it, they got on a train and came to Cottage Hospital. I think 14 people made it to Cottage Hospital for treatment. So 23 deaths, 14 people being treated here, everybody else treated right there on the beach where it happened.
Mrs. Charles Atkins from the nearby town of Surf, affectionately called Ma Atkins by the sailors, worked tirelessly, cooking and passing hot coffee to the young men, all with a smile and words of encouragement the boys would remember the rest of their lives.
And I can't remember how she found out about it. She came down and she was going to make food for all these sailors. They're there in their underwear and they're covered with oil and they're cold, starving, and she started out making them coffee and sandwiches. And then somebody came along, some doctor said, we need your help. And she went and worked on these injured sailors. And then she went back and set up this kitchen, and I guess she endeared herself to the sailors, but there had to be several hundred.
To know that your bunkmate was one of the ones that drowned, that's got to be gut-wrenching to deal with.
You can bet that anybody that ended up in the water like that after a collision so unexpected at that speed in the middle of the night, in the middle of the fog, there was a lot of PTSD that went on and that these people probably had to deal with for the rest of their lives. And we didn't know what it was called then. We didn't know how to treat it.
A lot of these kids were stressed by, I don't want to go back to the farm, but I don't want to stay on a ship that could go aground and collide. And every night when they went back on a ship, every time their last thought before they went to bed was, I wonder if I'm going to wake up on the rocks. That fear had to be inside of a lot of them every day.
More miracles during the rescue literally came out of the fog, as early the next morning, 4 fishermen of the Bueno Amor de Roma risked life and limb in the heavy surf to rescue all the rest of the men stranded on the jagged rocks.
I've just always been impressed with the camaraderie and for a lack of a better term, the gentlemanliness of the fishermen in this community. And I know a lot of them, and a lot of them are my friends down at the marina. And the fact that the fishermen are the first ones to show up and selflessly help out does not surprise me at all.
Even Commodore Watson was duly impressed.
Captain Lassetti and his men should be recognized for their courage and perseverance.
While many sailors on land were being given medical treatment, warm blankets, and hot coffee, there were still men trapped on the rocks in stranded destroyers.
A lot goes to credit for the people of that area.
That's kind of the American story in a way, I think, don't you? We're ready to pitch in when there's trouble.
The heroic actions of the men in Squadron 11 in the Southern Pacific Railroad, plus the entire Lompoc community and the brave fishermen of the Bueno Amor de Roma, embodied the very best in mankind. Following the rescue, Commodore Watson said,
"To command such men is a pleasure, and to share danger with them is an honor. To the courage and discipline of American sailors must be given credit for the fact that but 23 men lost their lives in the wreck instead of hundreds."
Within only a few weeks of the accident, a court of inquiry was convened to seriously investigate all of the events leading up to the accident.
And the court of inquiry will be the ones that determines, well, should anybody be court-martialed for this? And then that gets remanded to an actual court-martial trial.
Because the accident was such an embarrassment, the inquiry was originally intended to be held behind closed doors because national curiosity was at risk of getting whipped up into a frenzy by a hungry press. Under public accusations that the Navy was conducting its own whitewash, the Navy released its findings at the conclusion of the private proceedings, emphasizing that no one person was on trial yet.
From what I understand, they brought Blodgett up as a witness. They named the commanding officers of each ship for the Board of Inquiry, and then Blodgett starts to speak, and after he says like 2 sentences, the judge says, "You know what, from what you've just said, you are now going to be one of the defendants for the court-martial." You got to imagine if you're a witness at the Board of Inquiry and the first witness is now going to be a defendant at the court-martial. If I'm a witness, I'm a little nervous about what I'm about to say, right? And so they ended up court-martialing him as well.
An early surprise came when Admiral Cattell, at the behest of higher powers, assigned Lieutenant Commander Leslie Bratton to be judge advocate, alongside the court's president, Rear Admiral William Pratt. Bratton, the captain of the USS Stoddard, was one of the only squadron commanders who had originally questioned the Delphi's navigational plans and who had demanded his own RC bearings while in formation.
My grandfather was the skipper of the destroyer Stoddard, which was in Division 32. So he was one of the fortunate skippers that took their ships out to sea and avoided the disaster and then got back involved in the rescue. So he was a lawyer, but he was appointed the judge advocate for the Board of Inquiry afterwards, and then later judge advocate for the court-martial. And I think all of these officers were all probably friends and classmates at the Naval Academy and a pretty tight bunch, and so I'm sure it was a very hard thing for him to be involved in that role.
The fact that Lieutenant Commander Hunter, the commanding officer of the Delphi, was named in the court-martial was no surprise. But what was very surprising was his reticence to disclose that he had indeed taken over the role of navigator, which therefore implicated the ship's usual navigator, Lawrence Blodgett, which was clearly alarming to all of the numerous witnesses.
Donald Hunter doesn't admit at the Board of Inquiry that he is the navigator. Everybody assumed that it was Blodgett that was the acting navigator.
Admiral Pratt at one point pressed Commodore Watson, who'd been in his berth with Dooman, if alcohol had been a factor. Given that the country was still in the midst of prohibition, Watson gave the pat answer.
"There is no drinking on a destroyer. The ship is too small, and everyone would quickly know if drinking occurred. Everyone is in close association, and one cannot conceal liquor from the others."
This was a temperance community, and so there's rampant rumors that the Navy, the ship's captains, the ship's navigators, they were drinking. The facts didn't pan out that way, that there's a lot of non-factual information.
Another curious and suspect story centered around Commodore Watson's civilian berth guest, Eugene Dooman.
After the shipwreck, Dooman has to sneak off, never reclaims his money because he wasn't supposed to be on board. So he actually loses his $3,000, which I imagine was a lot of money back then.
Duman later claimed that he was worried that his presence on the ship would hurt Commodore Watson in the court of inquiry, and curiously, his name was never mentioned during the proceedings. And contrary to gossip perpetrated by the press regarding Watson's mystery guest and his strange cargo of silver, Eugene Duman did not simply fade away.
He was Ambassador Joseph Grew's number 2 right when World War II started. He actually had to be repatriated from Japan on a civilian prisoner exchange, if you will, during the war.
Commander Watson did step up and take full responsibility for the accident, but not without defensiveness. Lieutenant Commander Hunter, now known to have been the true navigator, offered excuses as well. Citing his decades of experience and reasons for rejecting the confusing radio signals from Point Arguello, he claimed he would have preferred to have some RC bearings or depth soundings to corroborate his estimated position before checking in with Rear Admiral Cattell on the flagship Melville. So, why didn't he? And to compound his errors, he arrogantly never consulted with any of the other navigators who were each doing their own calculations. There was some credibility to Hunter's reluctance to rely on the new radio technology as it existed in 1923. At that time, the equipment would always present 2 bearings, 180 degrees apart, almost as if a ship was in 2 places at the same time. However, this was easily counteracted by obtaining a second RC bearing from another station, thereby fixing one's position and eliminating the diametric reading. Hunter's defense during the court-martial was that the RC bearings were too difficult to obtain because of heavy usage by the USS Reno for the rescue operation of the SS Cuba. However, the court established that all other southbound Navy ships and commercial vessels were able to obtain bearings just fine, and that such calculations could be transmitted in under 2 minutes. One by one, objections raised by the defense were blown apart by facts and evidence. 20 days of investigations by the Court of Inquiry reconstructed the events and decisions, all adding up to the accident, which was plenty to be able to render its opinion.
Court of Inquiry initially determined that 11 of the people in the squadron should face court-martial. Watson, the skipper of the Delphi, Hunter, and the navigator on Delphi, Blodgett, and then the commanding officers of the other 6 ships that actually ran aground and sank. The 2 that hit bottom but got off, they were not remanded for court-martial. Nowadays, you touch bottom, it's always a bad thing.
The court presented the following charges. 1. Culpable inefficiency in the performance of duty. And 2. Through negligence, suffering vessels of the Navy to be run upon rocks.
There were 3 divisions, and the division commanders for the 2 divisions that had ships that ran aground were also remanded for court-martial. So Roper was the one division commander who wasn't, because he did the right thing and none of his ships hit the ground.
This goes back to maritime law, that the ship's captain is responsible for everybody on that ship, even though the orders were to follow the lead ship in that column. And if there's too many warning signs, you got to get out of there and save everybody and your ship.
This is a quandary for the Navy at this time, because they were following orders. Your orders are to follow the ship right in front of you, and that's what they did. Roper, who's got the 3rd Division and doesn't follow those orders, now are you going to find him guilty because he didn't follow orders?
Commander Roper's navigator had a more reliable fix on their true location, but in pettiness, Roper refused to relay that life-saving information to the Delphi after the previous sharp exchange with Commodore Watson.
Roper didn't follow orders but saved his ships.
Captain Herbert Roach of Squadron 11's USS Nichols was also singled out for court-martial under the basic maritime law that every captain is responsible for his ship, following orders or not. His radio men also revealed during their testimony that they had the RC equipment, but could only partially use it, and they not only intercepted and followed the Delphi's RC bearings, but also thought their captain should have taken a depth sounding. Asymmetric justice was applied when Captain Roach was found guilty of negligence for the same circumstances that could have been applicable to many of the other captains of the squadron, because those same facts did not come up in their testimonies or that of their crews. In addition to recommending the expected court-martials, the Court of Inquiry also produced 10 glowing letters of accommodations to sailors for saving the lives of their shipmates.
on the young Calhoun was mentioned for his bravery.
My grandfather was actually commendated because they could have lost a lot of lives, but he told the men not to abandon ship. They said because he saved all those lives, he was actually commendated. He ended up his career being a 4-star admiral.
Chief Arthur Peterson, he was the hero of this tragedy. Though there's 23 people perished, 745 were saved, and 70 of them were from the USS Young because of Chief Arthur Peterson.
I'm not sure why he didn't get a Medal of Honor. There were about 20 of them given out in the interwar period, and you look at what each one of those did to earn it. What Peterson did was in the realm. It might have been just because this was such an embarrassment to the Navy. I mean, this hit the press in a big way.
With military efficiency, the court-martial proceeded on the 1st of November, 1923.
What Watson did, which was considered a plus in his favor at the time, was he said, I'm responsible. Now, when faced with a court-martial, sometimes people will try to get out of it. But Watson was a stand-up guy. He took responsibility for the whole thing.
I don't want an acquittal. No, sir, I don't want it. For me to be completely acquitted by this court would be bad for the naval service, to which my father and I have devoted our lives. I believe that no man in charge of vessels of the Navy at sea should get away clear when 7 are wrecked and 23 lives are lost. I want punishment.
The judge advocate officially recorded.
The specifications of the charge prove, and that the accused, Edward H. Watson, Captain, U.S. Navy, is of the charge guilty. The court therefore sentences him, Edward H. Watson, to be placed at the foot of the captain's list of present date, and there to remain until he shall have lost 150 numbers in his grade. The specification of the charge proved, and that the accused, Donald T. Hunter, Lieutenant Commander, U.S. Navy, is of the charge guilty. The court therefore sentences him, Donald T. Hunter, to lose 100 numbers in his grade of present date.
Released from custody and returned to active service, the sentences handed down to Watson and Hunter ensured they would never gain advancement for the rest of their Navy careers. But finally acknowledging that Lawrence Blodgett had been relieved of his navigation duties, the court fully exonerated him of the culpable inefficiency and negligence charges he had faced after becoming a defendant in the court-martial. However, Captain Roche's single charge remained, despite attempts by members of the High Command to have this unfairness overturned. All remaining officers, including Commander Calhoun of the Young and Commander Seat of the Fuller, were fully exonerated.
They went back and commanded other ships and did good things, and they weren't trying to do something wrong.
I'm sure you grow from something like that. There are 2 ways you can go. You can just kind of fold up and say, woe is me, or just move on in a very positive manner. And he probably strived to really do well after that tragedy because he believed in what they were doing and all the people that had perished. He probably wanted to do well for them too.
The things they did to save each other, to try to save their ship, it really was a credible reflection on the type of people who were actually in the Navy.
My grandfather never talked about it. The first time I ever heard about the tragedy at Honda was when his ring was discovered. It was his class ring from the Naval Academy, and he had put it on his dresser the night of the accident. And when the ship crashed, he ran to the wheelhouse and everything turned upside down, and he thought it was lost forever. But every Naval Academy ring has their names engraved inside. So this diver found it 63 years later, and it was the last dive of the day, and he saw this glistening. He couldn't believe it, and so he brought it up, and it took a while to figure out how to trace it back to my grandfather. And my grandfather had passed away at that time, but they gave it to his widow. He used to talk about the ring, that he would have loved to have had it, and When she got it back, it meant a lot to her. He also had a ring from John C. Calhoun. That ring was also lost. So there's still scuba divers that are diving on the wreck looking for that ring.
I've heard it said that, the study of history makes you smarter and heritage makes you proud.
Lompoc is very proud of their heritage. The Honda Point tragedy is memorialized in the community through the Lompoc Valley Historical Society, the Lompoc Mural Society, and the Veterans Memorial Building. Newspaper clippings, photographs, actual wreckage from the Honda Point tragedy are all memorialized in the community here.
Well, I would say to present day and the future is, again, when you go back and if you study this event, it is a case study in making assumptions, getting fixated on your plan to the point that you're not willing to deviate, taking risk when you didn't really need to. Nowadays, we would call it operational risk management, which is to look at why are you doing this? Do you need to do this? What are the dangers you're going to encounter? Is it worth doing this way? But when you look back, you can't say that any one of those things is wrong, but when you add it all up, the cumulative effect just leading to that disaster.
Having gone to the Naval Academy, it was never discussed or pointed out as a teaching moment to learn from the various mistakes or misjudgments that were made.
I have made this run, yes. We came out of San Francisco and immediately hit a very dense bank of fog, and it hit me then a lot of the similarities between our trip and the Desron 11 trip there.
We were making the transit. We had the quartering seas. We had the same low vis.
It was a little bit eerie. The similarities were not lost on me.
It was one of those, hey, do you know what happened in 1923? Let's talk about it. This is what we want to avoid. Here were some of the mistakes that were made, and this is how we're going to mitigate them.
We needed to have some technological solutions to it. So Point Aguelo, the radio beacon, we need to train the people ashore as well as the people out at sea so they understood the importance of what they were doing. We need to have more radio stations because one in a 100-mile stretch of coast is not going to give us what we need. And if you're going to get two, then you can get cross fixes from those people, which led to Loran. Radar so you could figure out where the land was.
We have so much knowledge today. Agencies like the U.S. Coast Guard and the U.S. Geological Survey, we know the currents of the ocean now. If there's an earthquake in Japan, Oregon, Alaska, Hawaii, they all have tsunami warnings now. They know what's going to happen. And the global positioning satellites are used on everybody's cell phones and everybody's car dashes now. And so using GPS satellites today, and it's just poetic that GPS was launched from this base just a few miles away from Honda Point, where navigational errors occurred.
Today's Navy employs a wide array of advanced technologies for the positioning and safe passage of their ships, including radar, sonar, GPS, inertial navigation, and digital dead reckoning, as well as traditional methods used by ancient mariners such as visual fixes and celestial navigation. With so many varied technologies at their fingertips, sailors are trained to combine multiple navigational techniques alongside operational awareness to ensure the safety of personnel and material.
There's people solutions and there's technological solutions, and sometimes you need both. Sometimes one will solve it, sometimes the other one will solve it. So in this case, technology was going to solve a lot of the problems that occurred here, but the people answer was you've got to train people to speak up when they see there's a problem.
When I was a squadron commander and I would have a new pilot check in, I would sit them down and said, your most important thing in life is to save mine. And if you see something and you don't share it, and it's going to hurt me and my family, then shame on you.
If I met Captain Watson and Hunter today, I would love to study their leadership principles of that time and compare it to today. Organizations in general, they decentralize authority to empower the organization.
The Navy of today, we want everybody's voice to be heard. You want them to say, Captain, you may be right, but this is what we think. Training is a big part in today's world. Balancing ships, making sure you have the right skills to go with the right threats is a big part of your job. And we do those things to protect people and to make sure that we do things right.
And learn basic seamanship and fellowship with the people that you're going to be working with, and they're counting on you.
Lieutenant William Moores was executive producer and benefactor of this documentary. Born the same year as the Honda Point disaster, his fascination with its history grew while serving with the Navy Seabees during World War II in the South Pacific. He first scuba dove Devil's Jaw in the 1970s, and then again in the 1990s with Dan Purdy, who found Commander Calhoun's ring. Bill dreamed of telling the story of the disaster as a documentary. While he didn't live to see it completed, he immensely enjoyed his work on the film, as did our crew.